The preacher's words still echoed in the wind as the young woman stood beside him, barefoot, bruised, and trembling beneath a sun-bleached bonnet. The sale had been made. $19 for a 19-year-old girl, a single gold eagle coin, and 9 silver dollars, counted out slow on a splintered church pew. Her father didn't even stay to shake the buyer's hand. He just pocketed the coin, spat in the dust, and rattled away in his rickety wagon, leaving nothing behind but the stench of cheap whiskey and betrayal. Cole Hunter, a widower with nothing left but a patch of land and a grave under the cottonwood tree, had just bought himself a stranger. He watched the dust cloud where her parents had disappeared, his face a mask of stone. The townsfolk muttered behind their hands. The sheriff, a man named Barlow with a gut full of beer and a spine full of jelly, pretended not to see the girl's torn sleeve or the faint, ugly bruise blooming on her collarbone. Cole could only stare. She wouldn't look him in the eye. Not then. Not even when thunder cracked above the church roof, a dry, angry sound that promised a storm that might never break. As the first fat drops of rain began to speckle the dirt, she whispered something he couldn't quite hear. He leaned closer. What was that? Her voice was a thread of sound, so quiet it was almost swallowed by the wind, but this time he heard it. Don't let them find me. Before we jump back in, I'm Thomas, the voice behind the story. If you're enjoying this, drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss how this story unfolds. Because what started as a desperate man's choice turned into a fight for a girl's life, and a past neither of them saw coming. Cole Hunter led the horse toward his wagon, the girl trailing a few feet behind him like a ghost tied to a string. She moved with a slight, almost imperceptible limp, favoring her right side. Her hands were clenched into small, white-knuckled fists at her sides. He didn't offer to help her into the wagon. He just waited. After a moment, she hitched up her patched skirt and climbed aboard, settling on the hard wooden bench as far from him as she could get. The ride to his homestead was silent, not a peaceful quiet, but a loud, screaming silence, filled with the things they weren't saying. The town of Whisper Hollow shrank behind them, a sad collection of broken fences and peeling paint. It was the kind of place where secrets were currency and everybody was poor. Cole's land was different. It was on the edge of everything, pressed up against the canyons that bled into the Badlands. His cabin was small but solid, built with his own 2 hands. A chimney of river stone stood straight and tall. A single cottonwood tree stood guard over 2 simple graves, his wife, Sarah, and his son, who had never drawn a breath. He pulled the wagon to a halt near the porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. For a long time, neither of them moved. The girl stared at the 2 graves, her expression unreadable. "This is it," Cole said, his voice rough from disuse. She said nothing. She just slid off the wagon and stood there, a thin, lonely figure in the vast, empty landscape. She looked breakable. She looked like she'd already been broken a dozen times over. Cole's heart, a thing he thought had turned to stone 2 years ago, gave a painful lurch. He had paid her father $19. But as he looked at her, standing there with the weight of the world on her shoulders, he knew he hadn't bought a girl. He had accepted a burden, a promise. He walked past her and up the porch steps, pushing the door open. He lit a lantern, casting a warm, flickering glow inside. The cabin was sparse, but clean. A stone hearth, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a single bed in the corner. He'd thrown his wife's things away, all but 1 trunk. He turned to find the girl still standing exactly where he'd left her, her silhouette framed by the dying light. "You can come in," he said. She took a hesitant step, then another. She stopped at the threshold, her eyes darting around the small space, taking in every detail. She was looking for threats, for escape routes. Her body was coiled tight, ready to spring. "You're safe here," he said, and he meant it. Her eyes finally met his, just for a second. They were the color of a stormy sky, and in their depths he saw a fear so profound it made his own grief feel small. Then she looked away, down at the floorboards. That night, she slept on a pallet of blankets he laid for her by the hearth. He took the chair, a rifle laid across his lap. He didn't sleep. He listened to the sound of her breathing, shallow and uneven. He listened to the wind howling outside, like it was trying to claw its way in. He listened for the sound of hoofbeats that he prayed would never come. Sometime in the dead of night, he heard her whimper, a small, wounded sound. He stayed perfectly still, his hand tightening on the rifle. Was she having a nightmare? Or was she remembering? He thought about the $19, a gold eagle, 9 silver coins. He reached into his pocket and pulled them out. The metal was cool against his palm. He'd handed them to her father, a brute of a man with soulless eyes. But just before the man had turned to leave, something had been pressed back into his hand. A tiny folded piece of paper slipped to him with the handshake the town thought he'd refused. He hadn't looked at it yet. He'd been afraid to. Now, in the dim lantern light, he carefully unfolded the scrap. The handwriting was faint, spidery, and hurried. It wasn't from her father. It was from a woman. Protect her. The sale is a lie. He doesn't know. The debt is real. Don't let Burke find her. Cole stared at the note, his blood running cold. Sale is a lie. Debt is real. Burke. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. Burke Consincade. A name whispered in saloons, a drifter, a gambler, a man known for collecting debts with interest paid in blood. Suddenly the girl's words echoed in his mind. Don't let them find me. It wasn't a plea. It was a warning. He looked over at the sleeping girl, a stranger he'd brought into his home. A stranger who had just pulled him into a war he didn't understand. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was about a hell of a lot more than $19. The next morning, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken questions. The girl was awake before him, sitting on her pallet, knees drawn to her chest. She watched him with those wide, wary eyes. She looked like a trapped animal, trying to decide if he was the hunter or the rescuer. Cole wasn't sure he knew the answer himself. He built a fire, put a pot of coffee on to boil. He didn't speak. He just moved with a quiet purpose, the way he always did. He felt her gaze on him, tracking his every movement. He knew he had to show her the note. He also knew it might shatter the fragile, invisible truce that existed between them. He poured 2 cups of coffee, the bitter, smoky smell filling the small room. He set one on the floor near her pallet. She flinched, as if expecting the cup to be thrown. He ignored it and sat down at the table, taking a slow sip from his own cup. Your mother, he said, his voice low. She gave me this. He held out the folded scrap of paper. The girl stared at it, her face paling. She didn't move. She just stared at the note like it was a coiled snake. Take it, he said gently. Her hand trembled as she reached out. Her fingers brushed against his, and a jolt went through him. Her skin was ice cold. She snatched the paper and unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words. A choked sound escaped her throat. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. She looked up at him, her eyes wild. He knows? He told you? He told me nothing, Cole said, keeping his voice even. Your mother gave me the note. I don't know who Burke is. I don't know what debt she's talking about. The girl scrambled to her feet, backing away until her shoulders hit the cold stone of the hearth. You're lying. You're one of them. You bought me for him. The accusation hung in the air, sharp and ugly. Cole felt a surge of anger, but he pushed it down. This wasn't about him. This was about the terror that had been living inside this girl for God knows how long. I'm not one of them, he said, his voice firm but quiet. I saw the look in your father's eyes. I saw the way the town looked at you. I saw you. He took a breath. I don't know your name. It's Lahi, she whispered, the name falling from her lips like a stone. Lahi, he repeated. He stood up slowly, making sure his hands were visible. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to let anyone else hurt you. But you have to tell me what's going on. Who is Burke? Tears began to stream down her face, silent and hot. She raised a hand to her jaw, her fingers tracing a faint, pale line that he'd noticed before, but hadn't wanted to ask about. A scar. He gave me this, she choked out. Burke Consincade. He said a pretty mouth should learn to stay shut. She shuddered, a full-body tremor. My father owed him money. A gambling debt. When he couldn't pay, he offered me. The pieces clicked into place, each one more horrifying than the last. The sale at the church wasn't a sale. It was a desperate, last-ditch effort by her mother to get her daughter away from her father before he could hand her over to a monster. The $19 wasn't a price. It was a signal, a plea for help. And her father, in his drunken cruelty, had played along, thinking he was selling his daughter for pocket money, never knowing he was being tricked by his own wife. He came to the house, Lahi whispered, her voice barely audible. Burke. He wanted to collect his payment. I fought him. I burned his hand with a kettle. That's when he cut me. Her breath hitched. My father beat me for it. He locked me in the cellar. He was going to take me to Burke's camp the next day. But my mother, she let me out that night. She told me to run. She stayed behind. Cole felt a cold dread seep into him. And the sign? The one your father nailed to the post? It was for Burke, Lahi said, her eyes hollow. A message. That I was still his. That he could come claim me. When you showed up, I thought you were him. Cole stood there, the weight of it all crashing down on him. He hadn't just bought a stranger. He hadn't just taken on a burden. He had stepped into the middle of a war, and he had just painted a target on his own back. He looked at Lahi, this broken, terrified girl who had fought like a cornered wolf, and he felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. It was protectiveness. It was rage. And it was a deep, gut-wrenching understanding of what it meant to be truly alone, because he was alone, too. My wife, he began, his own voice sounding distant. Her name was Sarah. Lahi looked up, her tears momentarily forgotten, surprised by the sudden confession. Her family was wealthy, Cole continued, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Controlling. They didn't approve of me, a poor farmer with dirt under his nails. We ran away together. They sent men after us, not men like Burke, men with papers and laws on their side. They tried to have me arrested. They tried to declare her mentally unfit. He walked to the window and stared out at the two graves under the cottonwood. She was pregnant. The stress, the running, it made her weak. The town doctor was useless. By the time I rode for help, it was too late. She died screaming my name, and no one came. They were all too afraid of her family's power. He turned back to Lahi, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. The town, this whole damn valley, they look at me and see a grieving widower. But I know what I am. I'm a man who failed to protect his wife. I'm a man who let the woman he loved be destroyed by monsters. He took a step closer to her, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. I don't know what kind of hell you've been through, Lahi, but I know that look in your eyes. I know what it feels like to be hunted, and I swear on my wife's grave, I will not fail again. The cabin was silent, save for the crackling of the fire. The space between them shimmered with a new, dangerous energy. They were two broken people, haunted by ghosts and hunted by monsters. But in that moment, they were no longer strangers. They were allies. A flicker of movement outside the window caught Cole's eye. He froze. High on the ridge overlooking the cabin, a dark figure on horseback was silhouetted against the morning sky. A spyglass glinted in the sun. They were being watched. The hunt had already begun. The watcher on the ridge was a bad sign. A very bad sign. Cole didn't move, didn't even breathe. He just watched the silhouette until it turned and disappeared back over the rise. He didn't need a spyglass to know who it was, or who it was working for. Bert Consinkide wasn't a man who gave up on what he considered his property. He turned from the window. Lahi was still standing by the hearth, her arms wrapped around herself. The terror was back in her eyes, but there was something else there now, too. A flicker of fight, a spark of defiance. "He knows I'm here," she whispered. "He knows," Cole agreed, "which means we have to be smarter than him." The days that followed were a quiet storm of preparation. Cole taught Lahi how to handle the rifle he kept over the mantel. Not the heavy Winchester he used for hunting, but a lighter, smaller carbine that had belonged to Sarah. At first, Lahi's hands shook so badly she could barely hold it. But Cole was patient. He showed her how to load it, how to sight it, how to squeeze the trigger without flinching. "Aim for the chest," he told her, his voice grim. "It's the biggest target. Don't think, just shoot." She practiced for hours, shooting at old tin cans he set up on a fence post. Her aim was shaky at first, but she was a quick learner. There was a surprising steel in her. The more she practiced, the less she trembled. It was as if the cold, hard weight of the rifle was giving her a strength she didn't know she had. While she practiced, Cole fortified the cabin. He reinforced the door, barred the windows at night. He moved his bedroll into the main room, sleeping by the door with his Winchester within arm's reach. They worked in a strange, unspoken harmony. They were two soldiers preparing for a siege. A week after the watcher on the ridge, they had another visitor. It was Sheriff Barlow. He rode up on his fat, lazy horse, his belly jiggling with every step. He didn't come to check on Lahi's welfare. He came to snoop. "Cole," he said, tipping his hat with a greasy smile. "Just making my rounds. Heard you had some company." His eyes slid over to Lahi, who was standing on the porch, her face impassive. "She's my wife," Cole said, the lie coming easily to his lips. He'd gone to the preacher the day after he'd brought Lahi home, a quiet, somber man named Reverend Michael. He'd explained a version of the truth, that the girl needed protection, a new name, a new life. The preacher, a man who saw more than he let on, had agreed. He'd entered her name in the church register, next to Cole's, a marriage in name only, a shield made of paper and ink. Barlow's smile faltered. "Wife? Well now, that was fast. Ain't that the girl from the edge of town? The one whose pa put up that sign?" "Her pa's business is his own," Cole said, his voice flat and cold. "She's with me now." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. He dismounted and ambled closer, his gaze sweeping over the cabin, noting the reinforced door, the newly stacked cords of firewood. "Just looking out for the peace, Cole. There's been talk. A fella in town, name of Bert Consinkade. He's asking about this girl. Says her pa owed him something. Says the girl was part of the deal." "That's a lie," Lahi said, her voice clear and strong. It was the first time she had spoken directly to anyone from the town. Barlow looked surprised. He gave her a long, appraising look, his eyes lingering on the scar on her jaw. "Is that so?" "Well, Burke seems to think otherwise. He's got friends, not the kind of folks you want stirring up trouble in this valley." He lowered his voice, leaning in conspiratorially. "Look, Cole, I know you're a good man, but this girl, she's trouble. Maybe you should just give her back. Let her pa sort it out with Consinkade." Cole's hand instinctively went to the axe handle leaning against the porch rail. "Sheriff," he said, his voice dangerously low, "get on your horse and get off my land." Barlow held up his hands in mock surrender. All right. No need to get heated. Just some friendly advice." He waddled back to his horse and pulled himself into the saddle. As he turned to leave, he paused. You know, Cole, some men don't forget what's theirs, and Burke Consincade, he's got a long memory. He rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy silence in his wake. Lahey and Cole stood on the porch, watching him go. The sheriff hadn't been giving advice. He'd been delivering a message, a threat. He's working for him, Lahey whispered. The sheriff. He's on Burke's payroll. I know, Cole said, his jaw tight. They were truly alone. The law wouldn't protect them. The town wouldn't help them. They had no one but each other. That night, the whispers from the town reached their doorstep. Someone had snuck onto their land in the dead of night and left a bucket of pig's blood on the front steps. A crude, vicious message. It was meant to scare them, to shame them, to mark Lahey as unclean, an outcast. Cole was furious. He grabbed his rifle, ready to ride into town and find the coward who had done it, but Lahey stopped him. No, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Don't. This is what they want. They want you to be angry. They want you to be afraid. She picked up the bucket, her face set like stone. She carried it out to the field and dumped the blood into the dry earth. Then she came back with a pail of water and a scrub brush and began to methodically clean the porch steps, her movements precise and deliberate. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She just erased the stain, refusing to give it power. Cole watched her, his anger slowly replaced by a profound sense of awe. This girl, this woman, had a spine of pure iron. She had been beaten, sold, scarred, and shamed, but she was not broken. As she was finishing, her hand brushed against the porch post. She stopped. Her body went rigid. Cole followed her gaze. Carved into the wood, fresh and deep, was a symbol, a crude drawing of a snake eating its own tail. Lahey let out a sharp, ragged breath. It's his mark, she whispered, her voice trembling for the first time that day. It's Burke's mark. He's been here. He's been right here. The message was clear. The siege was over. The war was coming to their door. The next day, Burke Consincade made his move. He didn't sneak onto the property in the dead of night. He rode straight into Whisper Hollow in the middle of the day, bold as brass. And he wasn't alone. Tied to the back of his horse, a rope around his neck, was Lahey's father. The man was a wreck, his face bruised and swollen, his eyes wide with terror. Burke paraded him up and down Main Street, a cruel and public display of power. The townsfolk came out of their shops and homes to watch, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Sheriff Barlow stood outside his office, arms crossed, doing nothing. Burke pulled his horse to a stop in the center of town. Listen up, you good people of Whisper Hollow, he boomed, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. This man here, he's a thief. He made a deal with me, a promise, and then he tried to cheat me. He yanked on the rope, and Lahey's father stumbled and fell into the dust. But I'm a reasonable man, Burke continued, a smug grin spreading across his face. I don't want this coward's life. I just want what I'm owed, and what I'm owed is his daughter. A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was worse than gossip. This was a public shaming, a declaration of ownership. But it ain't just about the girl anymore, Burke shouted, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, landing on the mercantile, the bank, the land office. This man, in his drunken stupor, he told me a secret about this valley, a secret about a map to a stolen claim. The word claim hung in the air like a lit stick of dynamite. In this part of the country, a claim meant gold, silver, a fortune. The very word could make men kill. And you know who knows where that map is? Burke's grin widened, becoming predatory. His daughter, the girl that farmer Cole Hunter is hiding out on his ranch. She's the key to the whole thing. Cole and Lahey heard the news from the blacksmith's boy, a teenager named Finn, who had a good heart and fast legs. He ran all the way to the ranch, bursting into the cabin, breathless and wide-eyed, spilling the story in a rush of panicked words. Lahi turned white as a sheet. She sank into a chair, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "A map?" Cole said, looking at her, his mind reeling. "A stolen claim? Lahi, what is he talking about?" Lahi looked up at him, her eyes filled with a new kind of fear. It wasn't just fear of Burke anymore. It was the fear of a secret so dangerous she had buried it deep inside her. "It's true," she whispered, her voice cracking. "My father, he wasn't just a drunk. He was a prospector, a good one. He found something, a huge silver lode, up in the canyons." The air in the room grew thin. This changed everything. This wasn't just about a gambling debt. This was about a fortune. "He made a map," Lahi continued, her words tumbling out. "But Burke and his men, they found him. They beat him, tortured him, tried to get him to tell them where the lode was. He wouldn't. They stole the map, but it was useless without the final piece of information. A landmark. A specific rock formation that marked the entrance to the mine. My father, he told me what it was. He made me memorize it. It was the only thing he ever gave me that was worth anything." She buried her face in her hands. "I was supposed to keep it a secret. It was my only inheritance. My only escape. Now, Burke knows I have it. He won't stop. He'll tear this valley apart to get it." Cole walked over to her and placed a hand on her shoulder. Her whole body was trembling. He had thought he was protecting a girl from a bully, but he was standing in the way of a gang of thieves and a silver mine. "Where is this landmark?" he asked quietly. Lahi looked up, her face streaked with tears. "That's the worst part, Cole," she whispered, her voice filled with despair. "The landmark he made me memorize. The rock formation that marks the entrance to the mine." She took a ragged breath. "It's on your land." The revelation hit Cole like a physical blow. The mine wasn't in some distant canyon. It was here, on his property, under his feet. The 2 graves, the cottonwood tree, the cabin he'd built with his own hands. It was all sitting on top of a fortune. A fortune that was about to bring a war to his doorstep. His land. Sarah's land. The only thing he had left of her. And now it was the center of a greedy, violent storm. That night, they came. Not Burke himself. He was too smart for that. He sent 3 of his men. They came on foot, moving through the darkness like shadows. But they underestimated Cole, and they underestimated Lahi. Cole had been expecting them. He'd placed empty tin cans on the fence lines, a crude but effective alarm system. When he heard the faint rattle in the distance, he was ready. "They're here," he said, his voice grim. Lahi didn't panic. She grabbed the carbine, her face pale but determined. The girl who had flinched at a loud noise was gone. In her place was a woman ready to defend her home. The first shadow appeared near the barn. Cole raised his Winchester, sighted down the barrel, and fired. The shot echoed through the night, followed by a curse and the sound of a body hitting the ground. 1 down. 2 more figures broke from the darkness, running towards the cabin. Lahi was at the window. She fired the carbine, the shot going wide. But it was enough. It made them hesitate, dive for cover behind the water trough. "Keep them pinned down," Cole yelled, reloading his rifle. What followed was a terrifying exchange of gunfire. Bullets splintered the wood of the cabin walls. A slug shattered the window next to Lahi, showering her with glass. She didn't even flinch. She just moved to the other window and kept firing. They were holding them off, but they were outnumbered. It was only a matter of time before the men got bold, before they rushed the cabin. "I have an idea," Lahi said, her voice tight with tension. "The lantern, on the porch." Cole looked at her. He knew what she was thinking. It was a crazy risk. "They'll see you." "They're not looking at the porch," she said. "They're looking at the windows, at us. Give me cover." Before he could argue, she was moving. She crawled across the floor, staying low, keeping below the windows. She reached the door, took a deep breath, and then threw it open. For a split second, she was silhouetted in the doorway, a perfect target. Cole laid down covering fire, his shots forcing the two men to keep their heads down. In that brief moment, Lahi lunged onto the porch, grabbed the lit lantern, and hurled it with all her might towards the barn. The lantern shattered against the dry wood of the barn wall. Oil splashed everywhere, and the flame ignited it instantly. Whoosh! The side of the barn went up in a sheet of fire, illuminating the entire homestead in a terrifying, flickering orange light. The two men by the trough, blinded and exposed by the sudden blaze, were caught completely by surprise. Cole didn't hesitate. He took aim and fired twice. Both men went down. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the roar and crackle of the burning barn. The attack was over. They had won. For now. Cole rushed outside. One of the men was dead. The other was wounded, clutching his leg and groaning in pain. The third man, the one Cole had shot first, was also alive, trying to crawl away into the darkness. "Get some rope," Cole grunted to Lahi. They dragged the two wounded men into the cabin and tied them to chairs. The barn was a lost cause, burning itself out in a massive funeral pyre. But they were alive, they had a prisoner, and they had answers. Cole stood over the man he'd shot in the leg, his face hard as granite in the flickering firelight. "You're going to talk," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You're going to tell me everything, who you're working for, how many of you there are, everything." The man, a scrawny outlaw with beady eyes, just spat on the floor. "Go to hell." Cole didn't flinch. He just looked over at Lahi. She was standing by the hearth, her face smudged with soot, the carbine still in her hands. She looked exhausted, terrified, but resolute. "He said Burke isn't the one in charge," Lahi said, her voice steady. "When he was trying to get my father to talk, he mentioned another name, a man named Silas. He said Silas wouldn't be as patient as him." Cole turned back to the prisoner. "Silas? Who's Silas?" The man's eyes widened in fear. The fact that they knew the name had rattled him. He clamped his mouth shut. "Fine," Cole said. He picked up a burning log from the fire with a pair of tongs. The end glowed a malevolent red. He held it close to the man's wounded leg. "I don't have time for games." The man started to sweat, his eyes darting from the glowing log to Cole's merciless face. "Wait, okay, he stammered. "Silas Kane. He's the boss. Burke's just his lieutenant. Silas runs the whole operation. He's got men all over the territory. He's not a man you cross." "Where is he?" Cole demanded. "I don't know," the man cried. "Nobody knows. He stays in the shadows, gives the orders through Burke." The man's eyes darted towards Lahi. "He wants the girl, not just for the map. He has a thing for collecting pretty things." A cold fury washed over Cole. He threw the log back into the fire. This was worse than he could have imagined. They weren't just fighting a greedy drifter. They were fighting an organized gang, a phantom leader, and a man with a sick obsession. The other prisoner, the one who had been quiet until now, suddenly spoke up, his voice raspy. "You're dead. You're all dead. Silas knows about the mother." Lahi froze. "What? What about my mother?" The man smirked, a bloody, broken expression. "He knows where she is. Some little town in Georgia. He sent Burke a message. If the girl doesn't come to them, they're gonna go pay her dear old ma a visit." The threat hung in the air, more chilling than any bullet. They had thought they were in a siege, but it was a trap with jaws closing in from all sides. They could fight off a dozen men here, but they couldn't protect Lahi's mother 1,000 miles away. Just then, a piece of paper fell out of the first prisoner's pocket. Lahi bent down and picked it up. It was a letter. The handwriting was faint, spidery, and familiar. It was her mother's handwriting. "My dearest Lahi," it began. I am so sorry. I am ill, living in a charity home in Savannah. I need to see you one last time. Please come. Lahi stared at the letter, her face a mask of horror. It was a trap. A vicious, calculated trap. They were going to use her own mother as bait to lure her out from behind Cole's protection. She looked at Cole, her eyes wide with desperation. What do? We can't just let them get to her. Cole's mind was racing. They were outmatched, outgunned, and outmaneuvered. Any logical man would tell them to run, to take what they could and disappear. But he looked at Lahi, at the fire in her eyes, at the unbreakable strength she had shown, and he knew they couldn't run. Running was what monsters like Silas and Burke counted on. We don't run, Cole said, his voice low and determined. We fight. He looked at the letter in Lahi's hand. They want you to go to Georgia. They think they're setting a trap for you. A slow, dangerous smile touched his lips. So we'll let them. He looked at Lahi, a new, daring plan forming in his mind. We're going to spring their trap, and then we're going to turn it back on them. Lahi stared at him, her heart pounding. The idea was insane. It was suicide, but it was also the only choice they had. How? She whispered. They think you're a scared little girl, Cole said, his eyes glinting. They think I'm just some dumb farmer. They have no idea who they're dealing with. He took a breath. We're going to Georgia, but we're not going there to surrender. We're going there to hunt. The decision was made. It was a desperate gamble, a long shot into the heart of enemy territory. The journey to Georgia would be a week-long race through hostile country, with Silas Kane's men likely watching their every move. They left the two prisoners tied up in the root cellar with enough food and water to last a few days, along with a note for whoever found them, explaining the situation. It was a risk, but they had no other choice. They packed light, ammunition, dried rations, and the deed to the ranch, which Cole tucked deep into his saddlebag. He also contacted an old friend, a former Army scout named Elias Vance, who owed him a life debt, sending a message with the blacksmith's boy, Finn. He told Elias where they were going and who they were up against, asking him to contact the federal marshals. It was a shot in the dark, but it was their only hope for official backup. The journey was a tense, grueling ordeal. They traveled mostly at night, sticking to old game trails and avoiding main roads. Cole taught Lahi the finer points of tracking, of reading the land, of moving without a sound. She soaked it all up, her fear sharpening her senses. She was no longer just a survivor. She was becoming a warrior. One night, huddled by a small, smokeless fire, she turned to him. Cole, why are you doing this? You could have turned me over to the sheriff. You could have saved your own skin. Cole looked into the flames, his face etched with shadows. When Sarah died, I died with her. For 2 years I've just been a ghost, tending to graves. Then you came along. He looked at her, his gaze intense. You're not just fighting for your life, Lahi. You're fighting for mine, too. You reminded me that some things are worth dying for. A home, a promise, a chance to stop the monsters from winning. The words hung between them, a confession more intimate than any touch. In that moment, something shifted. The alliance forged in fear and necessity deepened into something more profound. A bond of shared brokenness and a shared will to become whole again. They arrived on the outskirts of Savannah, a city that felt like another world, humid and sprawling and full of strangers. The charity home, mentioned in the letter, was exactly what they'd feared. A rundown, isolated boarding house on the edge of the swamp. It wasn't a hospital. It was a fortress. Men with rifles lounged on the porch, their eyes cold and watchful. This is it, Cole said, his hand resting on the pistol tucked in his belt. The plan is simple. We get your mother, and we get out. Elias and the marshals should be on their way. We just need to buy some time. But the plan fell apart the second they stepped inside. The house was a hornet's nest. Burke Consincade was there, grinning his snake-like grin. But he wasn't the one in charge. Sitting in a plush armchair in the center of the room, sipping brandy from a crystal glass, was a man who radiated cold, reptilian power. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. This had to be Silas Kane, and standing next to his chair, her face pale with terror, was Lahi's mother. "Welcome, my dear," Silas said, his voice smooth as silk and sharp as a razor. "I'm so glad you could join us. Your mother was just telling me all about you." Lahi's mother looked at her, her eyes pleading. "Lahi, I'm so sorry." "Silence," Silas snapped, without even looking at her. The woman flinched and fell silent. "Now," Silas said, turning his cold eyes on Lahi. "Let's dispense with the pleasantries. You have something that belongs to me, a piece of information, the location of my mine. You will tell me now." Cole stepped forward. "She's not telling you anything." Silas chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "The farmer, I've heard about you, loyal, brave, foolish." He gestured to his men, and in an instant Cole was surrounded, pistols leveled at his head. "You are in no position to make demands," Silas said calmly. "Now, Miss... What is your name again? No matter. Tell me where the mine is, or I will have my men start carving pieces off your protector here, and then we'll move on to your mother." Lahi stood frozen, trapped. The marshals weren't here. The plan had failed. They were going to die. But then she looked at Cole, at the defiant look in his eyes. She looked at her mother, at the shame and fear on her face. And then she looked at Silas, this smug, arrogant man who thought he had already won. And the fear inside her burned away, replaced by a cold, clear rage. She had been running her whole life. She was done running. "All right," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I'll tell you." Cole looked at her, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. Silas smiled, a triumphant, predatory expression. "It's called Widow's Peak," Lahi said, inventing a name on the spot. "A rock formation that looks like a woman in a veil. It's in the Devil's Jaw Canyon, 2 miles north of Cole's ranch. The entrance is in the mouth of the cave at the base of the peak." She was sending them on a wild goose chase, a dangerous one. Devil's Jaw was known for flash floods and rock slides. It was a death trap. She was hoping to buy enough time for the marshals to arrive. Silas studied her face, his eyes narrowed. "You're a terrible liar, my dear," he said softly. He sighed, a theatrical gesture of disappointment. "I had hoped we could do this civilly." He nodded to Burke. Burke's grin widened. He walked over to Lahi's mother and pressed the barrel of his pistol against her temple. "Last chance, girlie. The truth, or Mommy gets a third eye." Time stopped. The room was silent. Lahi's mind raced, searching for an escape, for any way out. And then she saw it. A small detail she had noticed when they first walked in. A heavy, ornate tapestry hanging on the wall behind Silas's chair. And behind the tapestry, the faint outline of a window. It was a long shot, a crazy, impossible long shot, but it was the only one they had. She took a deep breath. She looked straight at Cole, and with a barely perceptible movement, she flicked her eyes towards the tapestry. Cole, ever watchful, saw it. He understood instantly. He gave a tiny, almost invisible nod. "Okay," Lahi said, her voice trembling now, but this time it was for show. "You're right. I lied." She looked at Silas, her eyes pleading. "The truth is, the landmark, it's tattooed on my back." It was a ridiculous, outlandish lie, but it was just the kind of sordid detail a man like Silas might believe. His eyes lit up with a sick, possessive gleam. "Is that so?" he purred. "Well then, show me." This was it, the moment of truth. Lahi slowly turned around, her back to Silas, her hands going to the buttons of her dress. Cole tensed, his body coiled like a spring. Burke was distracted, his gaze fixed on Lahi. Even Silas was leaning forward in his chair, his full attention on her. "Now, Cole!" Lahi screamed. In a single fluid motion, Cole exploded into action. He slammed his elbow back into the face of the man behind him, ducked under another's pistol, and threw himself forward, not at Silas, but at the heavy table in the center of the room. He upended it, sending brandy glasses and papers flying, creating a shield and a moment of chaos. At the same instant, Lahi ripped the heavy tapestry from the wall. Just as she'd hoped, there was a large window behind it. Without a second's hesitation, she grabbed her mother's hand. "Jump!" she screamed, and threw herself and her mother straight through the glass. They crashed onto a muddy embankment outside, the sound of shattering glass mixing with shouts and gunshots from inside. Lahi's mother cried out in pain, a large shard of glass embedded in her leg. But they were out. Cole came flying through the broken window a second later, landing hard beside them. "Go!" he yelled, firing his pistol back into the house. "To the swamp!" They scrambled down the embankment and plunged into the murky, chest-deep water of the swamp, the sounds of Silas's enraged screams echoing behind them. They were alive, they were free, but they were in the heart of the enemy's territory, with a wounded woman and a whole gang of killers hunting them. The escape was just the beginning of the nightmare. The swamp was a labyrinth of cypress trees and stagnant water. They slogged through the mud, Lahi and Cole supporting her mother between them. Every shadow looked like one of Silas's men. Every splash sounded like footsteps. "We can't keep this up," Cole gasped, his breath ragged. "Your mother's losing too much blood." Just then, they heard the baying of hounds in the distance. Silas had sent his trackers after them. They were running out of time. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the mist in front of them. Cole raised his pistol, but the man held up his hands. He was tall, wiry, with a weathered face and the calm eyes of a man who knew the wilderness better than his own home. "Cole Hunter?" the man asked, his voice a low drawl. "Name's Elias Vance. Got your message. Figured you might need a hand." It was Cole's scout friend. Hope, fierce and bright, surged through Lahi. Elias led them through a maze of hidden waterways to a small, concealed island where he had a dugout canoe stashed. As he tended to Lahi's mother's wound, he delivered the bad news. "The marshals are on their way," he said, his face grim, "but they're a day out. Silas has the local law in his pocket. We're on our own until they get here." As Elias worked, Lahi's mother looked at her daughter, her eyes full of tears. "Lahi," she whispered, "I was so weak. I should have fought him. I should have protected you." "You did, Mama," Lahi said, taking her mother's hand. "You sent me to Cole. You saved my life." For the first time, the anger and resentment Lahi had carried for years melted away, replaced by a painful, powerful love. Her mother, in her own flawed and terrified way, had done the best she could. They had to get back to Whisper Hollow. It was the only place they had a chance of making a stand. The journey back was a blur of fear and adrenaline. They stole horses, rode them into the ground, and stole more. They knew Silas and his men would not be far behind. They weren't just running anymore. They were leading the devil back to their doorstep. They rode into Whisper Hollow, looking like ghosts. They were covered in mud, exhausted and half-starved. The townsfolk stared as they galloped down Main Street and headed for the ranch. When they arrived, they found a grim sight. The barn was a smoldering ruin. The prisoners in the cellar were gone, and Sheriff Barlow was there, with 3 deputies waiting for them. "Cole Hunter," Barlow said, his face smug. "You're under arrest for kidnapping, assault, and murder." He held up a warrant. "Silas Kane is a respectable businessman. He's filed a complaint." Cole just laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You're a joke, Barlow. A puppet." "Maybe so," the sheriff sneered. "But I've got the badges, and I've got the guns." He nodded to his deputies. "Take 'em." But as the deputies moved forward, another voice cut through the air. I don't think so, Sheriff. It was Reverend Michael, the preacher. He was standing on the porch of the small church, and he wasn't alone. Standing with him were a dozen men from the town, the blacksmith, the store owner, farmers from the surrounding homesteads, and they were all holding rifles. "What is this?" Barlow stammered, his face turning pale. "This is a town tired of being run by cowards and bullies," the blacksmith said, his voice a low growl. "Finn told us everything. We found the men you left in your cellar, Cole. They told us the rest." The judge's wife, a woman who had once looked at Lahi with contempt, stepped forward from the crowd. Her face was grim. "Years ago, I lost my daughter to an outlaw this town was too scared to stand up to. I will not let that happen again." She looked at Lahi, her eyes filled with a new respect. "This girl is one of us. You want her, you have to go through all of us." Sheriff Barlow and his deputies were surrounded. They looked at the hard, determined faces of their neighbors, and their courage evaporated. They dropped their guns. The moment of triumph was short-lived. A lookout from the ridge fired a single shot, a warning. From the east, a cloud of dust was rising. A large group of riders, at least 20 of them. Silas Kane and his army had arrived. The siege began. The town of Whisper Hollow, a place once divided by gossip and fear, was now united in a desperate battle for survival. They turned the ranch into a fortress. The women, led by the judge's wife, loaded rifles and tended to the wounded. The men, led by Cole, took up positions behind fences and barricades. The fighting was fierce and brutal. Silas's men were professionals, but the townsfolk were fighting for their homes, for their lives, for their soul. Lahi was in the thick of it. She moved from position to position, bringing ammunition, water, and words of encouragement. She was no longer afraid. She was a leader. This was her home. These were her people. And she would not let them fall. As the sun began to set, the fighting died down. They had held them off, but they had taken casualties. They were running low on ammunition. They knew Silas would launch a final massive assault at dawn. That night, in a quiet moment in the battered cabin, Lahi sat with Cole. Her mother was sleeping, her wound cleaned and bandaged. "I was wrong about the claim," Lahi said, her voice low. "It's not silver." Cole looked at her, confused. "My father was a prospector, but he was also a geologist," she explained. "He wasn't looking for silver. He was looking for water." She looked out the window at the parched landscape. "This whole territory is in a drought. The creeks are drying up. But my father found a massive underground spring, a source of fresh, clean water that could sustain a whole city. It's the only one for 100 miles. The realization dawned on Cole. "The mine. It's not a mine," Lahi said. "It's the entrance to the aquifer. The landmark doesn't mark a silver lode. It marks the source of life for this entire valley." She looked at him, her eyes burning with intensity. "Silas doesn't want silver. He wants the water. If he controls the water, he controls everything. He can build his own empire right here." This was the final piece of the puzzle, the true stakes of the battle. They weren't just fighting for a ranch. They were fighting for the future of the entire region. And Lahi knew what she had to do. She had a plan. A final, desperate gamble that would either save them all or get them all killed. Dawn broke, painting the sky in bloody streaks of red and orange. The air was still, heavy with the promise of violence. Lahi walked out of the cabin, unarmed, holding a white flag. She walked past the barricades, past the stunned faces of the townsfolk, and into the no-man's land between the two forces. "Silas!" she yelled, her voice ringing out in the morning air. "Silas Kane! I'll make you a deal!" A few moments later, Silas and Burke rode out to meet her. Silas looked smug, confident. He thought she was surrendering. "I've had enough of deals, my dear," Silas said, his voice laced with contempt. "I'm just going to take what I want." "You can't," Lahi said, her voice calm and steady. Because you don't know where the real prize is. The landmark I told you about, the Widow's Peak, it was a lie. Silas's eyes narrowed. But I'll take you to the real one, Lahi continued. Just you, no one else. I show you the entrance to the spring. In return, you and your men ride out of this valley and never come back. Burke snorted. Why should we trust you? Because if you don't, Lahi said, a cold smile on her lips, I have men waiting at the entrance right now with enough dynamite to seal it forever. You'll get nothing. It was a bluff, a colossal bluff, but it was delivered with such conviction that Silas hesitated. His greed warred with his suspicion. Finally, greed won. Fine, he hissed. But if this is a trick, I'll kill you myself. Lahi led Silas on foot up the ridge behind the cabin, towards the single cottonwood tree that shaded the two graves. Cole's heart was in his throat as he watched them go. The entire plan rested on this moment. This is it? Silas sneered, looking at the graves. How sentimental. The entrance is just behind these rocks, Lahi said, pointing to a small, dark crevice. You'll have to crawl. Silas, his eyes gleaming with avarice, got down on his hands and knees and peered into the darkness. And in that moment, Cole stepped out from behind the rocks. He was holding his Winchester. Silas froze. He realized he'd been tricked, but before he could react, another figure emerged from the shadows of the crevice. It was Lahi's father. He wasn't the broken, terrified man from the town square. His eyes were clear, and he was holding a lit stick of dynamite. Hello, Silas, he said, his voice shaking with a righteous fury. Remember me? Silas scrambled backward, his face a mask of pure terror. At that exact moment, the sound of a bugle call echoed from the valley below. The marshals had arrived. Elias Vance had come through. Silas was trapped. He looked from Cole's rifle to the dynamite to the approaching lawmen. His empire had crumbled in a matter of seconds. Burke Consincade, seeing the tide turn, tried to make a run for it, but the blacksmith caught him with a flying tackle that ended the fight before it began. Silas, surrounded and defeated, surrendered without another word. Justice came swiftly. Silas and his gang were arrested. Sheriff Barlow was stripped of his badge and thrown in his own jail. The West, for once, had remembered the right way. Weeks later, peace had settled over Whisper Hollow like a gentle rain. The town was rebuilding, not just its buildings, but its community. Lahi's mother, her leg healed, decided to stay, her quiet presence a source of strength. Lahi's father, having found his courage, worked tirelessly to help rebuild the ranch, his hands finally creating instead of just taking. One evening, as the sun set, Cole and Lahi stood on the newly built porch of their cabin. The barn was being rebuilt, bigger and stronger than before. The ranch wasn't just a home anymore. It was a symbol, a sanctuary. They were married under the stars, with the whole town as their witness. The preacher, Reverend Michael, presided. The blacksmith was Cole's best man. The judge's wife was Lahi's matron of honor. Lahi wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself, and her hair was unbound. The scar on her jaw was barely visible in the firelight. When Cole slid a simple gold band onto her finger, he wasn't just taking a wife. He was honoring a partner, a warrior, a survivor. Years passed. The ranch thrived. It became a haven for those who were lost or broken, a place where people could find a second chance. They had a daughter, a little girl with Cole's quiet strength and Lahi's fiery spirit. They named her Sarah. One afternoon, Cole found Lahi sitting on the porch swing, watching their daughter chase butterflies in the field. He sat down beside her and took her hand. Her hand, which had once been cold and trembling, was now warm and steady in his. I remember the first day, he said softly. The fear in your eyes. I thought I was saving you. Lahi leaned her head on his shoulder. We saved each other, Cole. She looked out at the land, at her home, at her family. She had been bought for $19. She had been hunted, scarred, and terrorized, but she had refused to be a victim. She had fought back. She had found her voice. She had found her home. The ghosts of the past were finally quiet, and for the first time in her life, she felt completely, unshakably safe. She was not a debt to be paid. She was a treasure that had been found. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're always exploring the hidden corners of history and the human heart, and we'd love for you to join us on the next journey. Thanks for watching.